Now, the topic of attributions flows nicely into the second part of this chapter, where we talk about forming and maintaining impressions, where attributions help us form impressions. The attribution allows us to determine, is that action telling us something about the person, or is that action due to the environment? So how we attribute different behaviors can influence what we think of or the impression that we have of other people. But of course, there's a lot more to it than just what we've attributed to that person versus their environment. Impressions have a lot of other factors that we can talk about. Now, when forming impressions of people, we tend to see something called the primacy effect, where earlier impressions or earlier information that we're given about someone tends to be more easily recalled, and we tend to give a little bit more weight to the information that we get earlier on. So we're going to be a little bit more alert to the information that we receive first, and that initial information might even start shaping how we perceive any information that comes after it. In the textbook, they use the example of telling someone that you know a person who is intelligent, industrious, impulsive, critical, stubborn, and envious, or you could also phrase it as they're envious, stubborn, critical, impulsive, industrious, and intelligent. Now, those are the same words, just in different orders. And interestingly, that first group of words, if you're told that they are first intelligent and industrious, people tend to form a more positive impression of that individual than if you were first told that they are envious and stubborn. So that earlier information can shape how you form this impression, and so that first piece of information is really critical in how you're going to interpret and make an impression of someone else. Now, people are really good at forming very quick judgments based on this primacy effect, where the first information that we have, we can immediately form an impression of someone and feel like we know how to interact with them and what to make of them. But it's important to note that we're not just slaves to this primacy effect. There is also something called the recency effect. If you remember where we talked about primacy and recency probably back in 104, just in terms of remembering lists and things. But we also have the ability to remember things that have happened most recently. And over time, we can get away from our primacy effects. We can overcome our initial impression of someone, and we can be more influenced by things that we've seen them do recently. We can add more weight to actions that we've seen them take in more recent times, and we can overcome our initial impression. So our first impressions aren't everything. Next, we're going to talk about our mental sets and schemas, where we can start seeing the things that we expect to see. Now, we've kind of touched already on schemas back in the chapter on language, but we're going to get into it just a little bit more here. So when we talk about a mental set, we're talking about that you're perceiving the world in a very particular way. It's basically what we're prepared to view, or what we're prepared to interpret. And that preparedness can actually affect how we interpret information that comes in after the fact. If you're not ready to receive certain information, you might completely ignore it. So your mental set is going to determine which information you're focusing on. Now, we've talked about schemas as something that helps us create these mental sets. Schemas being mental frameworks that are going to help us organize and interpret information. So if you are going to go and meet someone and someone warns you, hey, that person is aloof and a little bit cold, so don't be nervous if they're not really that warm and friendly. So you might have that preconceived mental set from a schema of what someone who is cold and unwelcoming might feel like. So you have these pre-existing frameworks that you now interpret that person that you're expecting to meet. We can also run into stereotypes here. And stereotypes are a powerful type of schema. So they're going to be generalized beliefs that apply to a group or a category. In a lot of cases, a group or category of people. And so because a stereotype is a form of schema, it can shape our perception. So one study that looked at this had a video recording of a child. They called her Hannah. And people were asked to rate Hannah on her academic potential. So how good of a student is she going to be in the future? And one group of people asked to evaluate Hannah's performance were told that Hannah came from a middle-class family, an upper middle-class family, and therefore had sort of a wealthy background. The other group were told that Hannah came from a blue-collar family, where she wasn't wealthy, her family was poor. And so all of these people, the only thing they had to know about Hannah was observing her behavior in that moment and this background schema or stereotype that she came from either a semi-wealthy or a poor family. And the researchers found that these people would evaluate Hannah more positively when they had been told that she was from an upper middle class background. And they would evaluate her more poorly if she came from a poor background. So these stereotypes can start influencing how we perceive that behavior. And in this specific case, they had shown each group or each individual the exact same recording of Hannah's behavior. So it wasn't that they were picking up on different behaviors, it was the exact same tape. They were just framing it using a different stereotype. So it can have a dramatic effect on what we're seeing, and we can start seeing things that we expect to see. Which leads us to the next topic, which is the idea of self-fulfilling prophecies, where not only are we interpreting information in the light that we expect to interpret it, now we start creating what we expect to see. So a self-fulfilling prophecy is basically this idea that your expectations are going to affect your behavior towards others, which will cause that expected behavior to confirm your expectations. So we can use this example over here where you're told that your friend or this person, George, that you're going to meet is unfriendly. So you expect now that George is unfriendly. So maybe when you meet George, you're going to act coldly towards him because, well, you've been told he's an unfriendly person, so I'm not going to bother to be warm to him. So you're going to behave in an unfriendly or guarded manner. And that behavior, your actions, are going to cause George to respond in an unfriendly way because, well, you were unfriendly first. But George acting in an unfriendly way is going to confirm your expectation that George is friendly. So here, in this case, you don't actually know if George is unfriendly or not because the only action we see by George is that he's responding in the same way that you acted towards him. So George might be a really friendly person, but because you acted unfriendly towards him, he acted unfriendly in response, and your original expectation is confirmed. So we've experienced a self-fulfilling prophecy where by having your expectation and acting in a way that's consistent with your expectation, you've created an outcome that's also consistent with that expectation. In this next section, we're going to start talking about social influence, basically how being around other people can change our behavior. So first, we're going to talk about mere presence. This is the idea that simply having other people around can change your performance at particular tasks. So it can change your behavior. So this was first discussed by Triplett, who was looking at cyclists, and he found that cyclists would perform better. They'd have faster race times when they were racing against opponents, as opposed to when they were just running their own trials against the clock. So their performance was improved when there were opponents around. They followed up and started looking at children who were performing physical tasks in the lab, and again, they found better performance when there was another child co-actor in the room. Basically, when there was another person present, performance was improved. So overall, they were finding that the mere presence of either an audience or a competitor, some other individual, could enhance performance. But that wasn't the full picture. Sometimes you end up actually seeing the opposite, where having an audience makes performance worse. So what's going on when that happens? So another researcher, Zajonik, which is not pronounced very well, but basically they proposed that the presence of others was actually increasing our overall emotional arousal, and it was making us more likely to perform what he called our dominant response. So, what is our default behavior in this particular situation? If it's a new or a complex task, our dominant response is going to be to make errors. It's going to be to do something that isn't quite right, and we'd start seeing a drop in our performance. But if the task at hand is something that's simple or something that's well known, something that we know exactly what we're doing, our dominant response then becomes to do well at that task. And so this whole idea is called social facilitation, which is basically this increased tendency to perform one's dominant response in the presence of others. So when there are other people around, then you're going to do whichever behavior comes most naturally. So when the task is easy, when the difficulty of what it is that you're doing is fairly simple, you can usually do the correct response. If the task is hard, it's challenging or complex, you're usually going to have behavior that is incorrect. So this tells us that when we're trying to learn a new or a more complex task, it's probably a good idea to learn this task when there aren't other people around. So when you don't have an audience. This leads us to the idea of social norms, which are basically shared expectations about how we all think that we should act and behave, and just sort of how we govern our behaviors. These social norms can be part of established rules or laws, but in a lot of cases, our social norms are more implicit, things that you don't necessarily talk about. They're just things that you know. They're going to regulate our daily behavior without us being consciously aware of them. Though you can very quickly be made aware of these social norms when someone contradicts them. So my favorite example of this is if you're standing on an elevator and you're on the second floor and you're going up to the fifth floor, and somebody gets on the third floor. You're probably standing in the elevator facing the door because it's the way you came in, that's the way you're going to go out, and you probably have made lots of space for anyone else who joins in the elevator, and you're just going to stand there and face the door. If this person gets into the elevator and faces away from the door, or if they stand too closely to you, all of a sudden you're going to feel uncomfortable. And part of that is because this person who has entered the elevator is breaking social norms because they're behaving in an atypical fashion. They're not following these unspoken rules of how you're supposed to act in an elevator. And of course, these norms can change between different cultures, and even within cultures, they can change over time, which is good to keep in mind. Our social roles are going to build on that idea of social norms, because social roles consist of a whole set of norms that are going to categorize how people live in a particular social position, and how they ought to behave when they occupy that position. So each of us can have multiple social roles, and we can run into situations where those roles may clash. That's where we get something called role conflict. So the norms for the different roles that you occupy don't necessarily agree with one another. So you could be a student and maybe you're an employee, possibly a spouse or a parent. All of those roles are things that you might fill. And each of those might have different expectations, different rules that you should be following, different norms that are going to govern your behavior. And that conflict comes when sometimes they don't quite line up. And we can also run into issues where our social norms and our social roles can interact in really weird ways that cause some uncharacteristic behavior. So an example of this would be the Stanford prison experiment, which I usually end up talking about because it's so closely related to ethical issues. It was an experiment where a bunch of undergraduate students were assigned to be either prisoners or guards in a mock prison setup. And it was fairly unethical because the experiment had some pretty negative outcomes. There was lots of violence and poor treatment of people, and the experimenters didn't step in to stop the experiment. But in this case, we're actually going to be more focused on the idea that the bad behavior, the reason that it ended up being a fairly unethical study, came out of this social role. So those who had been assigned to be guards took on the role of guards. They viewed the others as prisoners as opposed to fellow students and treated them as prisoners. They acted in a way that they thought that guards should act, and a lot of times that behavior was very atypical for them. It wasn't something that they would have done following their own roles when they weren't part of this experiment, but because of the experiment, they took on the role of a guard, and it changed their behavior in very dramatic ways. So, for example, some guards would physically attack the prisoners who weren't behaving. Maybe they were rude or aggressive, threatening people. And all of these things were, in their mind, part of the role of a guard, but it didn't necessarily line up with their views as a student or as a person in general. So there's some really interesting conflicts that can happen there. Now, this idea of social norms and social roles seems to exist wherever humans form groups. But it's interesting to note that a lot of social customs are fairly arbitrary, and they seem to change with time. And they don't, when I say arbitrary, they don't necessarily link to anything in particular. Back in the 30s, a researcher found that you could have social norms developing in randomly selected groups over fairly arbitrary things. So this specific experiment was looking at a projected white dot in a dark room. And they asked students if they observed the dot moving. And for reasons that we won't get into here, there's sort of an illusion where if you stare at the dot for long enough, it feels like it's moving, so people would report it as having moved. So people would report about how much they thought that the dot was moving, and it ranged from a couple of centimeters to up to 30 centimeters at a time. And people tended to report about the same number. But if you put people in groups and allow them to hear what other people were saying, how much they thought the dot was moving, slowly the groups began to converge, and eventually they all reported the same amount of motion. So they converged and started reporting the same amount of motion. So they were adopting their own culture, or their own social norm. So they had converged on a group perception of that motion. And so this can happen in all sorts of places, and it seems to happen in all cultures. Basically, whenever you go looking for the formation of these norms, you run into them forming. People placed in groups seem to universally converge on standards for behaviors and judgments, which is kind of interesting, which I guess is why we're talking about it. And as part of these norms and things that we see across multiple cultures, you can see things like women taking on certain roles. What is their social role within a particular society? How you greet people, how you interact with people, how you stand in elevators. All of these can be social norms. And the example that the textbook uses, there's usually an image here, but that's fine. There's a movie, The $1 Million Baby, which shows a woman trying to be a professional boxer, which at the time that the movie was taking place was sort of a confrontational or a non-common type of role for a female to take. So it would have been something that people would look on as strange. It broke those cultural norms. But as time goes on, then it's become more and more accepted that that's something that anyone can do. It doesn't matter what your gender is. You can be a boxer if you want to be a boxer. So similar to this, these roles seem to change over time, basically depending on what people are exposed to and what that society deems as being the new norm.